Okay, I guess we can get started. Sorry about the delay. Yeah, so today we have a special session provided by Professor Shashank Verma, and he's gonna present a talk titled "The Cognitive and Developmental Alignment of Language Models." Okay, all yours.
Okay. Hi, guys. Nice to see you all. I'm not sure I recognize some of you, so I'm assuming you're CS?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Okay, I've seen the organizational emails. What's your name?
Zay.
Zay?
Yeah, Zay.
And then I think we might have met, right? Did you come with Caitlin and Laura?
No.
Oh, okay.
Well, like as like a PhD student.
Yeah.
With Laura, yes.
Okay. I think I met you once in the campus club, but maybe not. Oh, then I never met you. Okay, sorry. And what about you?
I'm a colleague of Zay's. I'm Anna.
Okay, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I think I know everybody else. Okay. So I'm going to give you this. Thank you for having me. This talk is one I gave to a bunch of linguists a month ago at the University of Georgia. They had like a linguistics conference. And at the time I gave the talk, my student Raj and I had just written a paper. And so really this talk, we submitted it on Thursday, midnight, anywhere on Earth. We were groggy. On Friday, I made the talk, and on Saturday, I drove to Athens and gave the talk. But surprisingly, it's coherent because I reviewed it before today. So I want to give you this talk. We don't have to get through all of it. I mean, I might at some point just skip steps, so we can ask questions along the way. How long should I speak for?
Usually about an hour, but I booked the room until 5:30, so yeah, plenty of time.
Okay. When people fall asleep, I'll start wrapping it up. Okay. Okay, so the plan for today is to talk a little bit about just conceptually what language models what kind of theoretical leverage they might give us, and to play that out in several domains, so number, language, concept, and concept understanding and fluid intelligence. But the real argument is going to be that we can not use these models not just to learn about how humans think or ask, do they think like humans, but also does the training trajectory of these models map the developmental trajectory of these abilities in kids? Which I think is a question that is not being asked as much by the ML folks. They care about cognitive alignment. It's increasingly come on the radar. I'll show you some work they're doing. But this is where, I have kind of a developmental training at some point, and we as psychologists or cognitive scientists, we know a lot about development. I think there's a lot we can offer them because this is something they don't really know that much about. Okay, here are three fields. Here's, in any given year, not the number of papers published in each field, but of the sum of all the papers published in these three fields, the proportion that each of these fields gets. Who wants to guess which field is the red line? You guys make a guess, yeah.
Cognitive science.
Okay, what about the blue line?
ML.
ML, and the orange line, then is neuroscience?
Yes, so.
Okay, actually, no. I mean, there's more neuro every year, but as a proportion of these papers, neuro share is going down. Neuro had its moment. They're the old kids on the block. But obviously ML is skyrocketing, dragging not just AI, if you want to differentiate the two, but cognitive science up too. And I don't think this is a coincidence. I think that cognitive science has got new energy very clearly over the last 10 years because of its relevance to AI and ML. Okay, so let's think about what are ML folks up to? So ML models are, they're essentially produced by folks that have engineering goals, right? They want to improve performance on benchmarks and be robust, and they have their own goals, and that's fine, okay? But as cognitive scientists, we care less about the absolute performance of our theories. In fact, often our theories are kind of useless predictive devices, but about gaining some insight into how humans work. And so these are somewhat different goals, right? And so from a cognitive science perspective, ML models are interesting to us to the degree, their performance profiles, maybe their accuracies or probabilities or response times match those of humans. If we can look at their representations, which we can, and see that they look like human representations, that's also interesting. And then at least for some kinds of ML models, not so much language, but more vision, we can ask, are they neurally plausible? Do the performance of the models in different layers map onto the layout of different brain areas and fMRI activation, for example? So even though ML folks are off kind of brilliantly developing these models and are kind of unconstrained by how humans do it. If we can see that they're tracking human performance in these ways, then we can just capitalize on their energy, their momentum. But it's not a guarantee that this will happen, of course. Okay, and so I told you I want to take a developmental perspective. And so there's two, the dichotomy in development is always to what degree is an ability underwritten by something built into the system, delivered to it by evolution, or to what degree is it a product of learning? This is every developmental, at different points in time, these two perspectives hold, maybe a little more dominance, but this is a question you can always ask. And so the way I'm thinking about it, the way our work in the lab, and Vijay, by the way, is part of these projects. I'm not going to talk about the ones today, maybe that Vijay is so core on, but the way I'm thinking about it is really the learning view is probably mostly right? But so the question is, what's the minimal endowment you have to build into the system so that then learning can do its magic thing, right? So right now, a neural network might have something about the architecture you could say is built in, or there might be some, but we don't sort of think about what will be built into a neural network. We just give it a bunch of data. So the lens I want to take when I look at how neural networks learn or how they improve in performance over their training is, can we see evidence that there's something like getting some minimal endowment in place and then an explosion in their growth or their alignment to human cognition? This is abstract. I'm going to make it more concrete, but I want to go to a classic model development to kind of explain what I'm getting at. So this is the epigenetic landscape by Waddington. His metaphor is this: the baby, the infant, is this ball right here. And if you let this ball go on its own, these are all cognitive abilities we might want the infant to develop. Some of these are quite easy. They're low energy states. You don't really have to do much work on this ball. It's going to want to wind up in these low energy states. So these might correspond to abilities like vision. Or language. You let some human loose in the world with enough interesting inputs, it's going to get vision, it's going to get language. You don't have to do much work. Other kinds of abilities, though, like let's say literacy, you can't just kids don't get literacy for free. You got to actually, or algebra, you got to actually do some direct effort in the environment to push them to get that. Sure, there's probably some cognitive endowment that helps them get there, but that alone plus experience is not enough. And so I think that the question I'm getting at, or another way to think about what I'm going to talk about is, what do we have to build into the system so that we get to these energy states that are they require something more. You can't just rely on pure learning. You got to rely on some kind of structure there. Okay, and we know that, like even something like vision is not built in. This is a classic example, a study about development. So Blakemore and Cooper took kittens, and at age 2 weeks, they put them in this environment and they raised them there for the next 4.5 months. So they couldn't see themselves. They had access to visual input, but whatever their genetic endowment had was learning on a very impoverished visual display, only vertical lines. And then when they took them out of this environment, they didn't have vision. They would run into objects because you need to, even if you have neural endowment that's good, a vision system, you need the right experience, the right learning to actually tune that thing up correctly. So often in development, there's always this question about what's built in. Even something like vision is not built in. It requires the right learning experiences to get vision. It doesn't come for free. And so that's the lens I want to take on the training of neural networks. Okay, what's got to be built in, but then what's then learned rapidly once you give it a rich enough experience? Or do we see that same effect in neural networks? Maybe we don't. Maybe we just see you give a neural network data and its performance, its alignment to human performance just linearly increases. Maybe that's what you see. I'll skip that one. Okay, so here's what I'm interested in. And so what I think ML models are interesting about is because they're a way to test this question. They're a way to, better than any other system by far we've ever had, to be able to ask questions about to what degree is learning sufficient? And if it's not sufficient, it's going to explain a lot more than we probably thought previously based on our abstract arguments. So let's figure out just how much we can learn from these models, and what we can't learn, we'll have to then maybe say, okay, maybe that's the thing that's built in. Maybe that's the minimal endowment. So that's another reason to sort of think about what's the minimal endowment as a kind of place where learning takes over. Okay, so that was very abstract. So let me go through some domains and show you what I mean. And so first I'm going to take on the question of number development. What's built into the system? What does a neural network learn about number? And at first I need to tell you about how humans process numbers, how adults think about numbers, and then I'll tell you about development. So a lot of you have seen this task. This is a number comparison task. You're told to put your fingers on each of those two buttons. You're going to see two numbers, and as soon as you see them, press the button underneath the larger one. Okay, so in the trial, you might see ready, this, and as quickly as possible, you press that, right? And so you might ask, how do you do this task? Well, this is the first experiment of this. This is going to be plotting the response time in seconds. So this is half a second as a function of the difference between the two numbers. Take the larger one, subtract off the smaller one. And so the surprising finding was it's not flat. It's not like you've memorized the single-digit numbers and could just retrieve in one unit of time which one's the greater. There's what's called the distance effect. The greater the distance between the two numbers, the faster people are. And so this caused people to posit that we have something like a mental number line, such that when we compare two numbers, we fixate those two numbers on our mental number line, and we try to discriminate which one's to the right. And the farther apart the numbers are, the easier the discrimination. This is very surprising, right? This kind of representation. So this is the representation that humans have for a number. In fact, it's a little more complicated than that. So that linear model produces a good fit, but an even better fit is produced if you assume that number line is actually log scaled. And a lot of things in sensation and perception are log scaled. So this is it's the case that 1 versus 9 is an easier comparison than 1 versus 2. But think about differences of 1. 2 versus 1 is an easier comparison than 9 versus 8. In fact, that winds up being the case. Okay, so these two facts, the distance effect, here's one way to think about the ratio effect. So you can plot essentially the ratio of the larger number over the smaller number. And when you do that, this is the kind of curve you get. Okay, so 9 versus 8 is the hardest one, right? That ratio is it's very close to 1. It's hard to discriminate those two. 2 versus 1 is a little easier, and 1 versus 9 is easier still. Okay, so these are two signatures of number. And so one question is, let's take a language model and say, does it learn something like this representation? And you might say, why would a language model learn that representation? I mean, we have reason to believe this is kind of underwritten by a neural structure in the head, the intraparietal sulcus. This seems like it's talking about sensation and perception and spatial qualities. Why would a language model develop number representations consistent with that? That's the first question I want to kind of take on. So we asked that question, and this is a cognitive question. It's not developmental. So we said, let's look at the number representations that these models learn, sort of, not quite the latest models, but models that were, current a couple of years ago, and say, can we see evidence that they have essentially learned by doing a kind of standard training task, running a model across a large corpus and having to do something like mass word prediction? Is it the case that they'll actually learn a mental number line? Now, this is an interesting claim because everyone, like I said, people have looked for the mental number line and seen it, not just in infants, but non-human animals. It's assumed to be built in. It's part of our spatial structures in our brain. So if a language model learns it, also, that suggests that maybe any system which wants to learn about number is going to wind up learning the structure, not because it's built in, innate, but because it's just the logical consequence of solving the number understanding task, which language models approach from a very different perspective than humans, perhaps, but it's still maybe functionally the same task. So how do we do this? So we looked at the distance effect and the ratio effect. We said, do these models show these two classic signatures? We presented the numbers to the models using three different kinds of notations. And so here's the computation we did. So I'm going to say this very abstractly, so yes, there are details here, but imagine we can read off of a language model a representation of a number on a given layer in that network. Okay, so that layer might have thousands of units in it. So we can look at that vector of thousands of activations. We can look at it for the model when it's seeing the number 8 versus number 4, and we could say how similar are those two representations. Okay, so we use something called the cosine similarity to evaluate how similar the representations of a language model at a particular layer were for two numbers. So this ranges between -1 and 1 meaning highly similar. So here we see in this little example that 4 and 8 are pretty similar representations. And we said to ourselves, okay, we need some way to go from cosine similarities to response times. And so our hypothesis was this: similarity is really the key concept. I told you the closer two numbers are, the harder it is to discriminate which one's to the right. Well, what does that correspond to in similarity language? The more similar two representations are, the harder it should be to say for the model which one is different, which one's greater. The more different they are, the easier it should be to see that those are actually different numbers. And so this is our kind of linking hypothesis, where we're going to go from similarities in a model to behavior in people. So this is a particular model, BART. This is a particular layer. All the models I showed you show this effect at almost all layers. So I'm not cherry picking something here. So this is going to be the similarity between BART's representations of number is a function of how different the numbers are, the distance between them. Okay. So here's the data from a trained BART model. So what we see is that same distance effect. The greater the difference between the numbers, the less similar the representations are. Okay. And we see that's a super linear kind of function. That's when looking at number words presented to the model. It's true whether you present the numbers as digits or as lowercase numbers. It's super strong. Okay. Here's another, I'm just cherry picking some results. Here's BART layer 2. This is that ratio effect. And you see it's there as well. Okay. So BART, in all the models, in fact, have learned something like a mental number line representation or something functionally equivalent to it, even though they don't have spatial reasoning. We can actually recover that. So I showed you that's the mental number line representation for humans. What we can do is we could give this matrix, we could imagine a matrix of these cosine similarities. We can give this the multidimensional scaling and say, give us a one-dimensional solution. In other words, align these 9 numbers on a single dimension such that the more similar two numbers are, the closer they are on that dimension. So we can statistically try to recover what's the model's mental number line or number line representation from those matrices. Here's a solution. This is GPT-2. I can't remember which layer it is, so I put XXX. And you kind of look at this and you're like, well, it's got some things kind of right? I mean, clearly one is quite different than the others, but there's some obvious differences, right? So 2 is displaced. Why? I don't know. I mean, maybe it's because language has a lot of names for double or two-ness or something. 5 and 9 are displaced. They're culturally important numbers given our base 10 number system and the way prices work. And people have observed this before. I'm not just, So I'm not saying it perfectly recovers this representation, but its latent representation is at least in the ballpark and kind of helps explain why it shows the distance and ratio effects. And again, you can see the full paper if you want to see the results for all the models at all layers. But we were struck by, I thought we were going to have to search hard for the model, which at these layers show the representation. But essentially, it's there for all the models we tested at all layers. I mean, it's a kind of rough sketch. Now, that's the setup for developmental questions, right? So I'm going to show you how now we can take that insight. Okay, they seem to, at the end of training, have learned something like a number representation like humans. But do they get there in the same way that humans do? As you train a model, does it develop this representation in the same trajectory that children, as they develop, also show this representation? Okay, so this is the question of development. I'm going to call this the question of developmental alignment. Okay, so what do children do? What does this look like in humans? So here's that same distance effect I showed you before. It looks flatter. That's because the scale is different. Before it was ranging from half a second to 0.7 seconds. So this is ranging from half a second to 1.5 seconds. And there's that negatively sloped line for adults. Okay, and then here it is for children of different ages. So what you see is that this effect is there even as a kid enters school. Of course, they're slower overall, and they really get killed when the difference is small. But essentially, it's the same representation. And in fact, as I kind of hinted before, this representation is known to be there in children, essentially, that are 2 or 3 days old, if you believe the kind of earliest findings. And it's there in non-human primates, and it's there in animals like fish and lions. I mean, it's there. This is a built-in representation. And so the question is,
Yeah, I have a quick question. So when you computed this difference, what was the main, what was the range of the numbers? Was it like mostly like, from 1 to 1,000, or is it like really big numbers, like
Oh, yeah.
1,000, because I think that would matter as well.
Yeah, we did 1 to 9. What happens when you go to larger numbers is there are certain place value effects you see. So if I say, what's larger, 19 or 81, it's actually a bit hard because part of you is looking at the ones place and saying, oh, 8's larger than 1. Okay, but the other part's saying, oh, but 1's less than 9. I can write this down. So here, this is an easy one. Which is larger, 89 versus 11? Okay. But if I do 81 versus 19, now all of a sudden, this is pulling for the right comparison decision, of course, but this is pulling for the wrong one. And it turns out that people do both in parallel, and this is a harder comparison for them than this. So there's all kinds of strange things that happen once you get to multiple digits. In general, we think people have a number line, but there's all these other kinds of effects that happen. So that would be an interesting thing to play with. I mean, as you're in CS, so you know these things tokenize numbers in tricky ways, and so there could be some complexity here. Okay, so this is what we'd expect to find in the model over development. We would see a distance effect at all points in training, but one which got crisper over training, right? That would be the equivalent of this developmental pattern. So is that the case? Well, the first investigations of this we did, so these language models are trained over billions of tokens, right? There's huge amounts of data that children would never see. There's an effort to try to get data sets that are more close to what a kid might see over the first 18 years of life. So here's a kind of prominent example in these data sets. It's kind of BS if you look at it closely and you have any kind of knowledge of psychology. Like they've crammed together childish, some classic developmental data sets, but there's no reason to believe this actually approximate what a kid sees. But at least it's an attempt to be more in scope with what a kid might see, on the order of 100 million tokens or whatever, not billions. So we trained a version of Roberta, on this baby LM data set, so something that's supposed to approximate what a kid might see over the first 18 years of age. And we looked at its training, at different epochs, different points in training. We looked at the distance effect at different points in training. Okay. So here it is after just one, look through a little bit of the data. And what you see is it doesn't have a distance effect. Very good one, right? This is going in the wrong direction. This is kind of right. And that one's flat, right? So after just a little bit of looking at the data, there's not really evidence of a distance effect. Okay. And I just want you to I'm just going to advance. And so, but it gets there, right? It doesn't take it very long to get there, right? Maybe it took it just a little bit of exposure here, but by early in its training, it's kind of figured out the distance effect. And then things get kind of crisper, right? The R-squareds get higher and higher until you get to the very end of where we stop training. So this was our little pilot study. So maybe there is something, maybe the trajectory of representation over training looks like that of a child's kind of functioning over development. Okay, so I want to remind you, these are the questions we have. So then we said, okay, let's do this at scale. Let's look at a more modern set of models. Let's do this properly across a bunch of domains. So here are the models that we looked at for this paper that we just submitted in February. So you can just tell by the years, or maybe you know something about these models. These are like kind of more like the current set of models that people care about. I'm going to focus my conversation or my talk on this Pythia family because what's interesting about it is they've made available all the checkpoints during training. So this is like an industrial strength model. In fact, it comes in different sizes too. And they have, at every point in training, said, okay, here's the set of weights. And so you can actually look at how Pythia develops any cognitive ability across its training. I mean, if we had the resources, we could, in theory, train up one of these ourselves. We just don't have the resources. This kind of stuff you need companies to do. Okay, so here's the question is, that little experiment showed a development of the distance effect, do we see it in Pythia, for example? And do we see it in Pythia models of different sizes? You need a certain size to be able to see this, okay? So we're going to look for the distance and ratio effect. Okay, so here's Pythia. This is anything from 70 million parameters all the way to 12 billion parameters. So the different size of models will be different lines. This is going to be the R squared. Basically, how well is it accounting for the distance effect? How much is that? Is this distance effect, if we compute it, that negative slope line? That's right there. This is as a function of how many tokens see. I think it sees. I don't remember how many it sees across the string. Some ludicrous number on the order of like 200 billion tokens or something like that. Okay. So that looks terrible. Let me show you the ratio. Actually, I'll go slowly. So just in a kind of ballpark, remember every line is a model of different size. We see kind of random stuff, okay? And then we see a period here at about 500 million tokens, where all of a sudden there's a kind of linear increase in the fit of the distance function. It becomes like a progression in the distance function, which looks like a linear improvement. And then we see out here the model doing random stuff. So I'm going to make a claim that this is the phase where, the model is a huge model. All these models are huge. They have tons of parameters, and they don't know anything at the beginning, small random weights. So I'm going to make the claim that during this phase, the model is essentially getting in position to learn something like human-like representation, but it's got a lot of work to do, right? We are born not as randomly connected networks, right? We are born with a lot of evolutionary input into what structures we're going to have, how they're structured, some kind of biases. The models are not. So I'm going to argue that this is where it gets to the point where it's acquired the minimal endowment to then learn in something like a cognitively realistic way, okay? And then out here, there's it's minimizing loss. It's getting better on its internal measure, but whatever it's doing out there is engineering. It's not relevant to cognition, okay? Claim. Okay, what about the ratio effect? The blue box is just heuristic, by the way. So again, this is clear, right? We see a pattern up to about, now in this case, let's say 0.3 billion tokens, where it's, whatever it's doing, it's not doing stuff that's cognitively interesting. And then we see an improvement, a linear increase in its kind of adherence to the distance effect. And then we see, again, out there past a few billion tokens, engineering. Yeah.
Okay, just got to clarify a question. So are you saying that this is model or human or baby, the existing distance effect or ratio effects are beneficial?
I'm sorry, say that part again. I was crunching this hard candy and I
so,
couldn't hear.
So I mean, to me, like if you want to be good at math, you shouldn't be swayed by these kind of distance effect or minimum effects. The difference between 1 and 2 and 88 and 89 should be the same.
It should be, but in fact, not only are we swayed by it, but we can look at how precise your distance effect is. We can measure it in you versus somebody else. And the more your mental representation adheres to the distance effect, the better you are at math. There's a correlation, actually, believe it or not, especially when you're young. Now, once you're, to make your point, maybe, once you get to be like a middle school, like 10 or 12, the quality of your distance effect no longer predicts math achievement, because presumably at that point, it's more symbolic and more, it's richer, right? But at least early on, for the first 10 years of your life, this is one of our best predictors of your math achievement, believe it or not. Even though it seems kind of not the right model, right?
Yeah, does it hold like when you are like, 18 years old or something?
No, basically by about 10 or 11 or 12, it stops being a predictor of your math achievement.
Yeah.
But when I say math achievement, I mean like a standardized test, essentially, like not just something that's about number. You might say, oh yeah, of course, that's going to be relevant to number. I'm talking about your ability to do arithmetic and stuff like that.
Yeah, because large language models, they're known to be not too great at these kind of numerical tests. And
yeah.
It seems that they sort of show abilities of like mid to high school level students.
Yeah, but that's but often those benchmarks are like, here's word problems, right? They're like, they look like standardized test items. The benchmarks are arithmetic kind of. This is a much simpler task, right? This is, and so I think the story might be different when we look at these cognitively guided tasks than what are in the benchmarks. But we'll return to that question. Okay, so here's this claim. The claim is this, that there's a zone where they do show monotonic growth in their number representation that parallels that of children. It follows some period where they have to sort of be put into place to capitalize on the environment. They're learning stuff here, but it's stuff that we might already have baked into the system. And then at some point, the cognitively interesting stuff stops happening, and then they're off minimizing error or loss because there's engineering goals they have to. So the claim that these models develop is not maybe accurate, but there's two interesting ranges where they're actually, I think, relevant to cognitive science. What is the minimal endowment that's got to be put into place before they can learn like us? And then, in fact, do they learn like us for other tasks besides just these two simple math effects? Okay, so let me show you this now for language development, which you might think, why wouldn't you start with language development? These are language models, but that's because I study math first, so that's why I started math. Okay. Okay, so there's a long history now of taking computational linguistics or NLP models and using them to try to model human performance. But now we're kind of in a different world. So now we're in a world where ML folks care less about these kinds of systems and more like we're going to evaluate the quality of a system by giving benchmarks. Let's assemble benchmarks and then have these be comprehensive benchmarks and then optimize our systems to improve performance on benchmarks. And so there's some nice NLP, there's some nice language benchmarks out there. In fact, developed by computational linguists, so we're going to use some of those. So not just like arbitrary, this seems intuitively as a computer scientist what should be a language benchmark. These have actually been developed by linguists. I'll show you some of them in a second. So we can ask the same question. How does the performance of these models change across training? And are there regions where it looks like human language development? Same set of models that I showed you before, focus on Pythia. We looked at the BLIMP. This is one of several kind of prominent language benchmarks, BLIMP. So it has, what happens is for like 12 linguistic phenomena, there'll be pairs of sentences which differ on some feature. Here it's the number agreement of the anaphor. So girls is plural, so themselves must be plural. That one disagrees. You basically say, which of these two sentences is more predictable for a model? I'll just leave it at that, right? You can evaluate whether a model thinks this is more acceptable or that one. So that's one kind of test in BLIMP. Here's a lower level one. So looking at the number between the noun and the verb, right? So plural, that one goes with it. But there's all kinds of tests here. And if you kind of squint your eyes, essentially, some of these are morphological. They depend on the structure, knowing the structure of words. Some of them are more syntactic, and some of them are arguably more semantic. I don't want to argue with you. That's what these folks claim. I'm a little less convinced this is right, but okay. So here's performance on there's like 1,000 minimal pairs of sentences in BLIMP. Here's performance on the BLIMP benchmark across training for the Pythia models across all those model sizes. Okay, so I think this is kind of interesting, right? We see the same minimal endowment period and then a linear increase in performance. Notice that model size doesn't seem to matter that much, right? So, Pythia with 70 million parameters and Pythia with 12 billion parameters, a couple orders of magnitude difference, are kind of the onset of language development is in the same place, and the slope of it is roughly the same. It's not dependent on model size. Okay, now that's overall. What about each of those three classes? So here's just if you look at just the morphology tests, here's that pattern. And here's just the syntactic, and here's just the semantic. And again, this sort of blew me away, right? You see the exact same pattern of minimal endowment, linear improvement, and then engineering randomness. You see a logical progression, right? You see, it seems like morphology, word stuff kicks in a little bit before syntax, which kicks in a little bit before semantics. And performance on the morphology tests achieves something like, 90%, whereas it doesn't do quite as well with syntax and maybe less well still with semantics. Let me just summarize that pattern, right? And so this was kind of neat, right? To see with a benchmark that's accepted by the NLP community, so it's a little less cognitively tuned, but one which they use themselves, to see roughly the same milestones, right? Look at those time points, right? They're happening at roughly the same place. You know, maybe a little later here for semantics. Okay. So that was language development. So we looked at this for two other domains, right? Because really what you want to do is you want to show that it's not special to number, it's not special to language. And so we looked at fluid reasoning and conceptual understanding. In part because if you think about kind of standard decompositions of intelligence, they'll often have, you know, like a language factor, a number factor, a spatial factor, a fluid reasoning factor. If they have a crystallized piece, they'll have some, you know, knowledge of your concepts. So we sort of chose these for reasons aligned with cognitive science more generally. We're not just trying to cherry pick abilities that we thought the model would show. So for those of you who haven't seen it, here's a measure of fluid intelligence, the classic measure, Raven's progressive matrices. So you see 8 out of 9 cells are filled in. Which of these shapes goes in that 9th cell? I'll let you think about it. Who wants to hazard a guess? Who thinks they know?
What was the question, sorry?
Oh yeah, look at the patterns in this matrix of shapes. Which of these do you think goes in is the missing shape? Which would fit the patterns? Who wants to give an answer? 5. How'd you get to 5? Anybody?
There's like 3 overlay patterns.
Uh-huh.
Or yeah. So there's a rectangle, there's 3 stripes, and there should be a 3rd black bar.
Oh, so the hatching, the shading is dark, stripes, blank.
Yeah.
We see stripes, blanks, we need a dark.
Yeah.
So that gives us one of these 2.
Yeah, and 3 is already up there, so 5 seems like logical. So,
Or one could argue also, not only the bar is the same orientation on every row,
yeah.
and different orientations across columns, so that also argues for this one being it, or the shape behind it. So there's lots of stuff going on here. The point is that this is supposed to measure your ability to reason about novel abstract problems, to induce patterns and apply those patterns. And you might think this is kind of silly, but fluid intelligence actually, of all the aspects of intelligence, is the one cognitive scientists probably care the most about. This is imagine you gave all these kinds of individual tests of cognitive ability to someone. You could probably tell from looking at them. Some of them are more languagey, some more mathy, some more spatially. You looked at the correlation matrix, people's performance on one test versus every other test. And so you make a matrix of those correlations, and you give those correlations to multidimensional scaling, and you say arrange these tests in space such that the more correlated 2 tests are, the closer they are in space. And so you can kind of see the emergence of a language factor, a math factor, and spatial factor. If you add ravens into this, ravens will almost always wind up at the center of that solution, which is to say it's the cognitive ability that's most closely correlated with all other cognitive abilities on average, right? It's the one closest to all points on average. So that's just a kind of a cute way to show. Ravens is important, and it's cognitively interesting. It's associated with working memory capacity, executive function, blah, blah, blah. We know something about how it develops. If you look at, so the Ravens problem, the Ravens test has a certain number of problems, and you can be scored on them. So if you look at kids that are people that are in the 75th percentile of performance on Ravens, this is how many problems they get correct to be in the 75th percentile as a function of age. And you see that, you know, performance on Ravens increases and improves over development. And so we can ask ourselves, do models improve on their Ravens performance in ways which match human development? Okay. And so we did this for Pythia, you know, all these other models as well. Now, you might say, okay, language models, they don't take inputs like this, right? And so Keith Holyoake, who's one of the sort of the gods of analogical reasoning and stuff like that in cognitive science, he and the students have basically developed a numerical scheme for encoding the features of the stimulus set, and then in a way which you can present just those number vectors, but at least they're symbolic. You can present those to language models, and you can get them by various means to try to predict essentially what's in that masked space. So do the Ravens task. So this is of a set of Ravens-like problems. What's the accuracy on these problems over training? So qualitatively speaking, you see a very similar pattern, right? We see a period of minimal endowment, where performance is not improving at all, but the network's clearly learning something. It's minimizing loss. And then at some point, there's a period where performance on ravens increases linearly. And then maybe there's a kind of saturation point. But I just kind of glossed, there's actually a couple of interesting things going on with ravens we didn't see before. One is now model size matters, right? Which is kind of funny because, we don't necessarily think about there being, well, ravens is, we want there to be individual differences in ravens. We use it because we think some people are going to score low and some people high. And here it seems like the size of the capacity of the network actually does govern the rate of improvement. There's a couple other factors. One is, notice the onset of improvements later. Before it was happening at like a couple 100 million tokens. Now it's a full billion tokens before ravens starts showing improvement. The model shows improvement on ravens, and that improvement really kind of lasts all the way through training. Remember before we kind of go crazy out here and I said engineering, but it lasts longer. It's not really engineering out here, it's still improving. And this is a slide I skipped earlier. The thing that's interesting about ravens is, it's underwritten, but it's the prefrontal cortex is really important, so is parietal cortex. These cortices develop later. They undergo synaptogenesis and pruning later, like let's say at age 5 or 6 is when they're really undergoing processes that the rest of the brain underwent earlier. And development in these areas from a neuroscience perspective lasts all the way through adolescence, right? So it's a much more protracted development you see in the frontal lobe and the associated abilities like working memory and EF. And you're seeing something like that here, I think, some echo of that. Like your performance on ravens, it doesn't start improving till later after a lot of other stuff is in place. Like here, the models can do number, they can do language, and it lasts longer. The window's longer. Okay, that's a lot of just so story, but I think it's possibly true. I think it's possibly true that these models are picking up on the fact that this ability is more difficult, and you just need to see more data to get it, or more development. Okay, I got time to present this other thing, so this will only take 5 minutes. So I'm going to present something about the last of these 4 domains. So number, language, fluid intelligence is concept development. And so this is preliminary stuff, I think. We picked a very famous effect in the cognitive science literature on how humans think about concepts called the typicality effect. So this is an original date. This is like the first study of this by Roche. She had people rate on a scale from 1 to 7 how good an example each of these exemplars was of the bird category. She did this for 10 categories. Now, this was an important effect. So you see there's a gradation, right? People say that robin and sparrow are better examples of the bird category than ostrich, for example. And this was an important effect because it knocked down what's called the classical view of concepts, which is that concepts are defined by a rule, which tells you whether something's a member or not. If that's the case, like maybe has wings and has a beak, if that's the case, people should rate these as all equally good examples of the bird category. But they're willing to say that some are better than others, which suggests something like a graded representation of concepts. So we looked to see whether these models also have graded representation of concepts. And we did it, there's a literature on this now. What we did was I want you to just think about this. There's a typicality gradient across the members of a concept. So we looked for that in these models. Here, I'll just go. Okay, so we looked at these 27 categories. This is from a larger set of 60 categories. Okay, so the way people look at this, Roche got those norms, those typicality ratings. But going back to the 60s, people have been giving subjects, okay, here's a category, tell us all the examples you can of members of that category and creating their own norms. So she had people rate the typicality of exemplars. In a production task, we say, bird, you got 30 seconds, list as many examples of bird as you can. And so this was sort of the latest norms in this genre of creating norms. So for example, for the bird category, they had a couple hundred subjects for 30 seconds list examples of birds. And this is the proportion of those 200 or so subjects that said blue jay, robin. So this is another way to get a typicality gradient, right? So here we see that robin and blue jay and eagle are in some sense more typical examples of a bird. If I say think of birds, they come to mind quickly. Whereas some of these like turkey or swallow or vulture, very few people produce it. So this is a rank ordering of birds in the bird category. These data give us rank orderings of items in these other categories as well. Why do we choose these 27 out of the 60 categories? These are all imageable. So we actually did the same experiment with vision models, but I'm not going to tell you about that. So we looked to see whether the models graded category structures for birds and others also followed what we saw in the human data. Okay. Okay, so what's being plotted here is for a given, let's say, pull out birds, we have the human rankings or typicality gradient. For a model, at some point in training, we say, how similar is your bird representation to your robin representation? How similar is your bird representation to your blue jay representation? So this is essentially, and so we look at, in that way, we can get a ranked ordering of birds from the model's perspective. Which exemplars are most like the bird representation versus least like it. And we could say, is the rank ordering of the model similar to the rank ordering of people for birds and for all the other 27 categories? And so this is the average Spearman correlation between the how similar the rank orderings are for the humans versus the model average across those 27 categories. Okay, that was a lot, but trust me, it's not that hard. It's the same thing we saw before, right? Minimal endowment period where nothing much is happening. And then the model has this linear increase in its correspondence to the human data. And then something like engineering is happening out here. I will say the model doesn't do very well overall. The average correspondence to humans is not that great. And this has been known. These models are actually not so good at doing typicality effects. So I do want to point that out, but the same qualitative pattern is there. Okay, we see the same. Maybe there's an effect of model size. I don't know. I sort of go back and forth on whether there's an effect of model size. Okay. So let me wrap up here. So what have we learned? Okay. So this was the question I started with, which is, given that these are two dichotomous positions in development, can we find evidence that these language models over training develop representations that are human-like according to something like a similar developmental progression? And do we find evidence that there's a sort of phase where the models have to get in position to then show this linear growth? And so I think we've seen something like that. And let me just show you the data again. Here it is across all four of those tasks. Okay. And I think in all four cases, for the distance effect, overall performance on the Blimp benchmarks, Raven's progressive matrices performance, and correspondence to the typicality effect, we see qualitatively the same pattern, I think, of get in the position to learn in something like a linear fashion, and then maybe engineering goals get satisfied in future training, but that's not really cognitively relevant. In some cases, we see an effect of model size, like for fluid reasoning, but I think in other cases we don't. It doesn't seem, somewhat surprisingly to me, that's not really important. It seems to be number of tokens seen, at least for this range of model sizes. Yeah. So I think this is this a coincidence? I don't know. Like, we've only done this with Pythia. The other we haven't found other models that really provide model checkpoints during training that are larger than Pythia. So I'd really like to know if this holds for another kind of model architecture. But I'm struck by the coincidence in those landmarks too. Okay. So where we're going. So once we establish ML models as credible models of development in a domain, what do you do with that besides the scientific goal? Well, in these domains, especially like language and math, there are well-known cognitive impairments. So in mathematics, if you fail to develop a proper mental number line, we know that. So let me say this backwards. In mathematics, the equivalent to sort of language impairments is something called dyscalculia, or mathematical learning disability, which basically means that you're otherwise intelligent, you have access to educational resources, and your standardized math scores are very low. Very behavioral definition. We know that people that have dyscalculia have disordered mental number lines. So this is kind of getting back to your question in some ways. So it's thought that one reason people are bad at math is they have a poor sense of number, the relative magnitudes of numbers, which cascades. It makes them not just bad at numerical reasoning, but makes them have difficulty with arithmetic reasoning, which then makes them have difficulty with algebraic reasoning. And so there's kind of a snowball effect. That's a theory about why people have dyscalculia. There's lots of possibilities. So can we take our models of development, of typical development, okay, and can we actually perturb them and get models of development towards an impairment? So can we, in some ways, see what are the possible ways in which a model can be derailed from typical, let's say, math development and wind up looking like a person with dyscalculia, and then take those perturbations as kind of hypotheses to go test and say, okay, maybe this is actually what results in people having bad math representations. Maybe it's about the experience you had. Do you have less experience with a number? Or maybe it's something about the wiring of the models that if you do it differently, causes you to have disorder representations. Okay, so that's one question I have. I think this is actually a super interesting question. Okay, now this requires some belief that these models in some ways are like the structures we have in our heads, which is probably not so credible for language models, but maybe a little more credible for certain kinds of vision models. So this is kind of a leap of faith. I mean, I'm not trying to say it's trivial to do this. It's not like looking at a non-human primate's brain and making an inference about a human brain. That's a pretty close inference. This is like an alien brain to a human brain, right? But it's worth taking on. And it maybe has a payoff. So, people are developing new interventions for language impairments and math impairments. It's really hard to test these things. You have to get samples of these kids, run them through the interventions. But if you've got a model that you think is actually a good model of, let's say, dyscalculia, and you have an intervention you think might help, you can put this model in front of your intervention and have it turn training on, and see if that intervention, in fact, normalizes the performance of that model. And if it does, maybe that's evidence that that intervention versus the other 9 other candidates you have in mind might be the one that's actually worth paying the money to actually run the study with you. So, there's all kinds of animal models and research and disease. So maybe we can turn these language models into cognitive models and study impairments and then ways to remediate them. Let me end by thanking, here's Raj. His work was a lot of the work I talked about today. He's kind of I like him a lot. He's a nice guy. So I just want to put a picture of Raj. Yeah, and I'll just stop there. That's all I have. Oh man, that's so tiny. You guys have any questions?
I have a question. No
Yeah.
one else has any questions.
Yeah.
Could you go to the kind of summarizing slide with all the plots?
Oh yeah,
of the
sorry.
different domains?
That's all the slides I didn't show you. Hang on a
Yeah.
second.
That one, yeah.
Yeah.
So from a computer scientist perspective, who knows nothing about these theories,
Yeah.
to me the language, fluid reasoning, and concepts, the patterns they show are pretty standard patterns when you train a machine learning model. When the training is done correctly. What's more striking to me is that the number domain, because there you're not comparing with the accuracy, but you're comparing the distance effect, right? And the fact that it actually shows, mimicking that of the human, that's actually more fascinating.
Oh, so you might say, oh, well, you'll grant me that the fact that there's the minimal endowment base is kind of interesting, right? It's not like a steady improvement. That's a bit surprising, right? Or no? You think on any benchmark? I'm asking you.
It really depends on how you initialize the weights.
Yeah.
I mean, so
Yeah.
maybe the length of these flatline can differ, but the general sort of pattern is kind of observable.
I mean, so some people talk about there's a power law that governs that the error, these kinds of curves. Like you're saying, oh, it's kind of a general finding to see this.
To me, yes. Yeah.
Maybe I'm saying, oh, there's a hinge point here. You're saying, yeah, it's just kind of a general power law. And then, and so, but you're saying this is what you see, but you're saying that's kind of cool at the top because that's actually not how well you do in a benchmark, but how closely your representations align to a human representation.
Yeah, because I didn't really expect that to be happening. Yeah, so that was pretty fascinating. Yeah.
This is in some ways also alignment, right? This is how well the model's ordering of the typicality of different birds, for example, corresponds to a human's ordering.
Yeah.
So this is also maybe in the same bin as number.
Yeah, I agree.
Right?
Yeah.
It's hard to say that it's getting better or worse. It's just getting closer to human performance. But these, I think you're right. Language and fluid reasoning are more like benchmarks, accurate. What number of items can you get correct? What percentage? Any other thoughts? Yeah.
As someone who's delving into like computation stuff, like this is my first year learning about anything. Are there like substantial differences that you would expect from different models, like outside of Python?
I don't have a good intuition about that. Yeah, I mean, NLP is moving so fast that essentially to even be in the conversation, you have to be using the latest models. And so I'm a little bit more worried about that. Like I sort of have to show people the latest models. Python is not one of them, but they have the checkpoints, but that are at least on the scale of the latest models. Otherwise, they'll say, well, whatever performance you're seeing might not be there in the latest models. So in some ways, it's a kind of, I don't mean faddish in a bad way, but really, we chose the models we chose because we wanted a variety of architectures. Let me just go back to that, one of those lists of all of our models. So these models vary within kind of a modern set of models on the architectures in interesting ways, but we don't have checkpoints on all of them. So it'd be great if across all these models with slightly different architectures and different kinds of training processes, if we could also then get the checkpoints, so we could look to see whether the same developmental curve is there, but we just don't have that. Nor do we have the capacity to kind of replicate this stuff because the models are just too huge. You sort of need to be an industry person to be able to train them. And these things are proprietary, right? They're locked away.
Yeah.
So.
Because I'm wondering, like, would you be able to like recreate graphs like those with something like Amber?
Yeah, so Amber has only a couple of checkpoints and doesn't have like a bunch of the Pythia group was nice in exploring model size and giving all the checkpoints. Yeah, so I think we're trying to search for other things like Pythia, but we haven't found any yet. We're also trying to search for the same kind of thing for the vision domain because we have a bunch of projects looking at what vision models know about number and geometry. We'd like to see whether the training, their progression over training also tracks how humans develop those abilities. So maybe stay tuned on that for next time. Any other questions? Yeah, Andreas?
More of a comment on the language part of what we tested. I couldn't see quickly enough what language forms to use, but it seemed to be based on the sort of the Chomskyan approach that has the assumption of the innate language acquisition device. And I would just be curious to see if anything changed if you came in from the functionalist school of linguistics.
So you're saying that these kinds of phenomena are ones that a Chomskyan might care more about than a non-Chomskyan?
Binding control, I mean, all that.
Oh, yeah,
It's kind of
theory specific, right?
Yeah, where the goal is to explain language in a very coherent theoretical model rather than just say it's trained on function and whatever we need to do in life. Not assuming that there's an innate language acquisition device, the brain just does whatever it does to get to language.
Yeah.
Just curious. It's just a comment.
No, it's a good comment. So there's a couple other benchmarks we've been looking at. One's called superglue, one's called glue, but they're not necessarily more linguistically informed as what you're talking about. So I think it's a question we're always trying to figure out what are some better benchmarks we can use. Some of them are, I think they're honest efforts. For example, we're doing a study now looking at modeling bilingual language acquisition with these training models in different kinds of bilingual environments and looking to see whether the effects you see in like the lag in L2 or something like that you see in these models. And so we're starting to look more closely, okay, what are the range of ways of assessing language and language development, language competence, but I've not delved too far into this.
The full emergent grammar research strand with Bybee and Hopper, and so they approached really like from the emergent angle, like how does language get to a grammatical form and point.
Yeah. No, here we're trying to see part of this is like when you switch fields a little bit, benchmarks rule in NLP. And so you have to show how you're doing on the benchmarks that people care about. So we have another set of students that I have that are working on looking at these as models of sentence comprehension, like word by word sentence comprehension. And there, you can really bear down on specific linguistic phenomena. And that stuff is really cool, that work. So far, well, yeah, I won't say too much more about it, but we have some interesting results. Okay, I'll say this. Okay, one is when you're reading a temporarily ambiguous sentence, I can't generate one off the top of my head. You could look, humans, we sometimes prefer one interpretation, and then they get some word which suggests that's the wrong one, and they get garden path, and they've got to like switch the correct interpretation, right? And we can look at this by, do they slow down a lot when they get to the word which is inconsistent with the representation they're building? And at the very end of the sentence, do they actually have the correct understanding of the sentence based on how they answer questions? We have two ways to do it. With these models, language models, at any point during training, you can say, given you've just read this segment of the sentence, what probability do you assign to these two sentences, one of which course is consistent with the one interpretation, one with the other? You can probe their semantic understanding along the way, in a way which you really can't with humans as easily. You can say, at this point, you can recover the parse tree, the implicit parse tree of a model. Chris Manning showed how to do this. And you could see, does it, at the point of disambiguation, does the implicit parse tree switch from the incorrect attachment to the correct attachment? From the incorrect structural interpretation to the correct one? You could see that dynamically. And the last thing is these transformer models have something called attention. It's a mechanism which basically tells you essentially what parts of the sentence the model is paying attention to as it's making its computation. That's a gloss. And you can look to see at those points of disambiguation whether there's a shift in attention that suggests that now it's gone from the incorrect interpretation or attachment to the correct one. These are ways to probe these models which are very natural, which are things we can't do with humans. And so you can ask much more interesting questions than this of these models. So I don't want you to think you're just limited to benchmarks. In some ways, it's what people thought fMRI was going to give us. Oh, we could look at the thing representation being built, but fMRI doesn't really, it's too slow. You can do this with these models in real time. And we have some cool results. But, yeah.
Just a clarifying comment, I think when these models are trained, they're not trained on these benchmarks. There's usually just next word prediction. So there isn't a Chomskyan assumption built in. It's almost just a functional assumption that it just needs to do whatever's necessary to predict the next word, but this covers these properties.
Yeah. Well, the question would be, if I asked the functionalist, okay, you don't like this benchmark, what would you come up with for a benchmark? And we could see if the models also are competent on those forms of language usage and whether they develop in. So, I mean, I'd totally be open to that. Yeah. This benchmark comes out of MIT.
Sure.
Very Chomsky in place.
Not a big surprise.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when you put up the Elmer Rosh table,
Yeah.
Which is Rosh, I noticed that all the way in the bottom, and of course this was an interesting phenomenon, psychologically, that it takes a long time for people to say no to isn't that a bird? Because there's so many bird like that. Almost as long to say yes to penguin. So I'm thinking of how these models handle category membership for non-members, whales or fish, things like that, where all of the characteristics, almost all the characteristic features are there, but none of the defined ones are there.
Yeah, I mean, you can ask the question two ways. One is, are they as confused by these borderline cases as humans are? The other one is, you can prompt these models. You can actually ask them, is a bat a bird, right? And you can see whether they know that a bat's not a bird. You can directly ask the model. I don't know what the results are when you do it with, say, ChatGPT or GPT-4.
And is reaction time informative when you ask them questions like that?
When you, not for the models that are locked away, but for these models, the proxy is often what's called surprisal or KL divergence. So you can basically say, when the model gets something surprising, gets some surprising input, like a sentence like a bat is a bird, does it view that as a kind of low probability sentence to see? Or is it kind of before that it had a distribution of probabilities across words, and then you get to the word bat to complete the sentence? Is there a shift in its probability? Basically, you could say, is the model sensitive to the fact that it just read something that's low probability or incongruous? There's different ways to tackle that if you have access to the full model.
And you remember Lakoff's work with hedges. So
I can't really.
Robin is a true bird. Technically speaking, a penguin is a bird. Roughly speaking, a bat is a bird. Do these models pick up on linguistic hedges?
You guys you have intuition? I bet you they would, but because people use it in language, and so these models just, yeah.
By hedges, do you mean like sort of like pragmatics, conversation pictures, that kind of stuff?
Just Lakoff called them hedges.
It feels pragmatic though, doesn't it? Or
It
you
does,
think,
yeah.
you think it's like a probability statement a little bit too?
Yeah.
It's a little bit of a probability being attached to it.
Right, so I mean, the way Smith, Chauvin, and Rips and those guys looked at it, like true, you have to have both the characteristic features and the defining features. Technically speaking, it's got the defining features, but not the characteristics. Penguin is a bird, an ostrich is a bird. And then technically, loosely speaking, which would kind of lead to my next question, which is like, metaphorically speaking, would these models roll with that? Metaphorically, a plane is a bird.
Type it into the models and get a probability and say,
I think if you actually spell out what you just said to the model as a proper prompt, I think they are able to pick up on that and generate some examples following your instructions.
see, so you literally would say to the model, you'd give it all the information, and then you would ask this question. It would have that in the context.
So they would know the difference between characteristic features and defining features?
No, you'd have to say it as part of your prompt. If you defined it and then you ask the model your question, they're actually surprisingly good. What they know, I don't know. It's an interesting question, right? But
So they translate that into probability and can spit out the right answer.
it kind of shifts
See how it works?
shifts the representation. Like you've given them that context, so now
So the word technically, like loosely speaking, in May, the model representation already contains like multiple different sort of use cases or meanings of the word technically. So it needs to figure out like what you really mean by when you use the word technically. So it does a better job when you actually spell out like what you intend the word to.
any other questions here? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much. Yeah. Hey, people online, we'll see you later. At least I'll see you later.
Thanks, Ashok.